Welcome to Midnight Mysteries. If you feel like listening to a horror story, you're in the right place. Let me know what you think in the comments. Enjoy listening. It was one of those dark and stormy nights when the sky seemed to shatter into a sea of lightning, brutally reminding you how wild and untamable nature can be. Simone, with eyes heavy from a long week of office work, felt a desperate need to escape. He had decided to take refuge in his corner of peace, the old country house he had inherited from his grandmother. That building was a whisper from the past, with its massive stone walls that seemed to tell centuries-old stories and high ceilings adorned with exposed beams that crossed like the bones of a forgotten giant. Despite the house showing obvious signs of time, with its cracks in the walls and creaking wood, it held an irresistible charm for Simone. It was a place that, despite its decrepit appearance, emanated an aura of warmth and familiarity, almost as if the walls themselves welcomed him with open arms. The air around the house was filled with an atmosphere of mystery, accentuated by the storm raging outside. Each flash of lightning illuminated the scene with a sinister light, creating shadows that seemed to come to life right before his eyes. As he drove through the old creaky gate and into the driveway, he couldn't help but feel a shiver down his spine. It was as if the ancient dwelling held forgotten secrets, whispering stories of ancient times with the wind that seeped through the cracks in its walls. Craving warmth and tranquility, Simone closed the door behind him, isolating himself from the fury of the storm and immersing himself in an almost supernatural silence, interrupted only by the beating of his heart and the creaking of his steps on the old wooden floor. He hurried to light a fire in the large fireplace that dominated the living room. The fireplace, wide and imposing, seemed like a portal to ancient times, ready to voraciously consume the wood and warm the room with its lively, crackling flames. The room's furnishings spoke of a distant era, with dark wooden furniture polished by time and the hands of those who had used them before him. The old black and white photographs on the walls depicted faces he had known only through those pictures, each with an unknown story hidden behind fixed eyes. As the wood in the fireplace crackled, sizzling under the grip of the fire, the room's atmosphere began to transform. The warmth spread slowly, battling against the cold that had seeped into Simone's bones during the journey. The fire's light cast a golden glow that danced on the walls, bringing images and shadows to life and making the environment intimate and welcoming. Outside, the rain continued to drum incessantly on the roof like a natural, unceasing melody, while the wind lashed against the house's walls, making them groan under its force. In this almost hypnotic scenario, Simone filled a kettle with water and placed it on the stove, the hiss of the gas breaking the living room silence. Wrapped in the warmth and sounds of the house, he finally felt distant from the chaos and pressures of city life. In that moment, and in that house that seemed like a world apart, he found a refuge, an oasis of peace amid the fury of nature and the obsessive stress of his work. As the water in the kettle began to whistle, signaling it was nearly ready, Simone headed toward the small pantry. Inside, it was full of forgotten objects and dusty memories. kitchen utensils, jars of spices years old, and most importantly, his grandmother's precious porcelain cups. He took one of these cups, delicately painted with thin flowers, an eloquent memory of a simpler, now forgotten time. Next to the cup, he chose a bergamot tea bag, his favorite, hoping its calming aroma could relax him after the long day. Just as he was pouring the boiling water into the cup, a subtle but distinct noise made him jump. It was a scraping sound, faint but insistent, almost as if someone or something was scratching the kitchen window. An involuntary shiver ran down his spine, and for a moment, the fire's warmth seemed less comforting. He quickly approached the window, peering out into the heart of the stormy night. Through the rain-fogged and condensation-clouded glass, all Simone could see was the distorted reflection of the kitchen's interior, mingled with the dark, confused hues of the storm outside. There was nothing, no shape or figure, just the darkness and the incessant beating of the rain. It was probably just a branch moved by the wind, he told himself, trying to convince himself more than anything. However, he couldn't help but feel a sense of unease creeping in. The house, with all its sounds and creaks, seemed to come alive in a way he had never noticed before. Even the sound of the tea mixing in the cup seemed strangely amplified in that tension-laden silence. Simone forced himself back to the living room, seeking comfort in the fire's warmth and the familiar sound of the wood crackling. But that noise had disturbed his tranquility, and the stormy night certainly didn't help him relax. As Simone tried to immerse himself in the warmth of the living room, seeking refuge in the reassuring glow of the fire, the scratching sound he had heard before returned, this time louder and more insistent. It almost seemed as if someone, or something, was deliberately trying to catch his attention, scratching against the glass with determination. Then, almost imperceptible among the thunder's rumble and the rain's drumming, a dull, distant moan reached his ears. It was a monotonous sound with no apparent meaning. Nothing natural came to mind. A deep, sad whimper. Simone's heart began to beat slightly faster, almost drowning out the calm he had tried to build with its accelerated rhythms. His instinct advised him to stay away from the window, not to investigate that unsettling presence that seemed to be calling him. It wasn't fear but a strange anxiety, and it was this slight difference that didn't keep him from approaching the window again. With cautious steps, almost as if he feared that any movement might trigger something unheard of, he approached the window. The pouring rain created a veil of water on the glass, distorted and fogged, making it impossible to see clearly outside. With a mix of fear and expectation, he slowly wiped a small circle in the condensation with his arm and wool sweater. What his eyes saw made him instinctively step back, his breath catching in his throat. A pale face, so eerie and distorted, was pressed against the glass, drenched by the incessant rain. The eyes of that figure were deep and hollow, dark circles that seemed devoid of any spark of life, staring at Simone with an intensity that went beyond the natural. The skin on the face was taut, almost as if it had been stretched beyond human limits, and the mouth was reduced to a thin line, twisted in an expression of indescribable pain and mute despair. Time crystallized, and for a moment, Simone found himself trapped in that gaze. The storm outside seemed to increase in intensity, almost reflecting the internal turmoil Simone was experiencing. There was something in that face, in those eyes, that awakened a primal sense of terror. Stunned and overwhelmed by fear, Simone took a step back, his heart pounding so loudly it seemed deafening. His foot clumsily stumbled over a chair, making the teacup he held in his hand sway dangerously. For a moment, everything seemed to move in slow motion. The swaying cup, the tea threatening to spill, the spectral face staring at him through the glass. A wave of cold swept through the room, as if the apparition had brought with it the night's chilly air. Every fiber of Simone urged him to run, to flee from that window, from that terrifying presence. Yet, despite the panic stirring inside him, his eyes remained glued to that tormented face staring at him with suffocating intensity. Then, almost as if it had been swallowed by the night itself, the face began to fade slowly, dissolving into the darkness enveloping the house. Simone remained motionless, his breath short and labored, staring at the spot where that figure had appeared and now was empty and shrouded in darkness. He didn't know if what he had seen was real or the product of a mind exhausted by fatigue and stress. For long minutes, he stood there, unable to move, while the storm continued to rage outside as if nothing had happened. The room's reality, the fire in the fireplace, the wood crackling, the now cold tea, seemed absurd compared to the surreal experience he had just undergone. With a start, he forced himself back to the present, to look away from that window that now seemed nothing more than a normal window, a bit shabby but still an ordinary wooden window. Perhaps it was that damn stress consuming him inside, making him see things that didn't exist, and he forced himself into this belief. But as he moved away, a sense of not being completely alone accompanied him, a sense of unease that couldn't be explained but wrapped around him like a thin, unsettling veil. After that terrifying vision at the window, Simone struggled to bring a sense of normalcy to the evening, an attempt to banish the haunting image that had so deeply shaken him. With hands trembling slightly, he took some candles from the shelf and lit them one by one, hoping their soft light and flickering flames could create a warmer, reassuring atmosphere. The room filled with shadows cast by the uncertain movements of the candles, and the slight smell of burning wax mingled with the aroma of the wood burning in the fireplace. Simone sank onto the couch, seeking comfort in the familiar fabric and the embrace of the cushions. Opening an old book he had brought with him, he tried to immerse himself in reading, hoping the printed words could distract him from the thoughts besieging him. But the words on the pages seemed to lose their meaning, turning into mere ink smudges before his eyes. His mind, despite his efforts, kept returning to that spectral face, its hollow eyes, and the despair that seemed to emanate from that apparition. Every time he closed his eyes, he could see that face, as if it were imprinted on the inside of his eyelids. In that moment, the boundary between reality and imagination seemed blurred, almost as if that apparition had left an indelible mark on the house's fabric and Simone's psyche. The comforting atmosphere he had tried to create with the candles now seemed almost oppressive, every shadow a dark reminder of what he had seen. The house, where he had desperately sought refuge, now seemed to hide dark corners and secrets everywhere. Every creak of the wood, every whisper of the wind against the windows, took on a sinister tone, as if it wanted to tell stories that Simone was absolutely determined not to want to know. Struggling against the growing anxiety and sense of isolation, he found himself longing for the comfort of human presence, a connection to the reality that seemed increasingly elusive. Time seemed to flow strangely in that house, distorting between reality and imagination. For Simone, 20 minutes or an hour passed in a flash. Time was measured only by the beats of his still agitated heart. In the end, trying to rationalize the experience, he attributed his terror to a mix of fatigue and stress. "It's time to sleep, dear Simone," he told himself, trying to convince himself that a good rest would chase away the shadows that had crept into his mind. With uncertain steps, he began to climb the stairs leading to his bedroom. Each step creaked under his weight, as if lamenting being disturbed in the night's quiet. It was just as he was climbing the last steps that the familiar and unsettling scratching returned, but this time its origin seemed to be the front door. The sound was accompanied by that moan, that restrained lament he had heard before. It was a sound that seemed to carve its way through the air, insinuating itself into his bones and head with a chill that went beyond the physical. A shiver ran down his spine, a cold that seemed to freeze the blood in his veins. He stopped, torn between the desire to flee to the apparent safety of his bedroom and the almost morbid need to discover the source of those sounds. He felt split in two between the instinctive need for safety and the human desire to understand, to confront the unknown. With a sigh that was halfway between resolve and resignation, he headed toward the front door. Each step brought his heart closer to his throat, each beat a hammer against his ribs. When he reached the door, he paused for a moment, breathing deeply to gather the necessary courage. With a hand still trembling slightly, he reached for the handle, ready to face whatever reality or hallucination lay behind that old, worn wood. With a deep breath, he turned the handle and opened the door, exposing himself to the elements and the mystery waiting for him. When Simone opened the door, he was immediately hit by the cold wind and the storm's pouring rain. The dim light from the torch cut through the darkness, but revealed nothing immediately evident. His first instinct was to retreat inside, to barricade himself in the safety of his bedroom and call the police. But then, a thought crossed his mind. He was in the middle of nowhere, in a rural area where houses were far apart. What if it was someone in need? A traveler caught by the storm, perhaps injured or seeking help. Guided by this thought, he grabbed an old torch from the hallway drawer and, with a decision that surprised even himself, took his grandfather's walking stick, a sturdy piece of wood resting next to the entrance. The stick gave him a sense of security, a link to the past, and protection against the present's uncertainties. With the torch in one hand and the stick in the other, he stepped onto the doorstep, letting his eyes adjust to the outer darkness. The storm seemed to have reached its peak, with lightning tearing the sky and thunder rumbling like cannon shots. The rain fell in an impenetrable veil, making it difficult to see more than a few meters away. Simone began to move slowly, illuminating the path ahead with the torch and scrutinizing the darkness carefully. Each step was accompanied by the dull sound of his boots on the wet ground and the incessant beating of his heart. He didn't know what he would find, but he felt he had to at least try. He had to know if that unsettling presence was just a figment of his imagination, or if there was indeed someone out there in the stormy night. All he could hear was the storm's roar raging around him, the wind howling through the trees in a spectral choir that seemed to carry the voices of the dead, distant and haunting laments. But of the creature, the entity that had scratched and knocked at his door, there was no trace. Only the darkness, the incessant rain, and the unsettling mystery of that stormy night remained as witnesses to the event. The void before him was an enigma, an abyss that swallowed any hope of explanation or understanding. Simone stood there for a few moments, his heart still pounding, his mind in turmoil, trying to grasp a reality that seemed to elude him. Then, with a sense of defeat and confusion, he slowly closed the door, leaving out the storm, the cold, and the unanswered questions. Returning to the living room, he relit the candles with hands that still trembled slightly, their flickering light a feeble attempt to restore a sense of normalcy to a night that was anything but normal. Simone sat on the couch, staring at the fire in the fireplace, lost in his thoughts. The night had brought with it mysteries and fears, an encounter with the unexplainable that would haunt him well beyond dawn. Still shaken by the unsettling episode at the door, he felt the need to find comfort in familiarity and happy memories. He headed once again to his bedroom, hoping the environment he had always associated with carefree moments of youth could offer some relief. The furnishings had remained unchanged for years, a true sanctuary of the past. The walls were adorned with old photos from when he was young and family portraits of happy moments, now looking at him with an almost melancholic air. The soft carpet under his feet created a slight contrast with the cold that seemed to have invaded the house, and the large wooden dresser, a sturdy and reassuring piece, still held the memories of his childhood. There were old toys, letters, and little treasures he had collected over the years, each with its own story and meaning. However, that night, the room that once seemed a safe haven now was filled with an unusual cold. It wasn't just the physical cold, which could be attributed to the storm raging outside, but a deeper, internal cold that seemed to envelop the environment in an unsettling atmosphere. Simone approached the bed and sat on the edge, looking around, trying to find the sense of peace the room once gave him. But every corner, every shadow seemed to carry a too vivid memory of the experience he had just lived, altering the perception of what was once familiar and reassuring. With a deep sigh, he lay down on the bed, trying to close his eyes and leave behind the night's shadows. But in the room's silence, with only the sound of rain beating against the windows, sleep seemed a distant mirage. The image of that face at the window and the mysterious scratching at the door continued to buzz in his mind, an unsettling presence that refused to be banished. It was as if those experiences had impregnated the room's very air, charging it with a palpable oppression, a tension felt almost physically. Every corner of the room seemed to vibrate with an invisible presence. Simone snuggled under the heavy covers, seeking refuge. He pulled them up to his chin, hoping the warmth of his body and the weight of the blankets could chase away that inner cold that had enveloped him. The light on the bedside table next to him was still on, but he closed his eyes, trying to find comfort in the familiar and reassuring sound of the rain beating against the window. He focused on the rain's hypnotic rhythm, constant and regular, hoping it would lull him into a peaceful sleep, far from the night's memories and sensations. For a moment, it seemed to work. The sound of the rain became a natural mantra, inviting him to let go, to forget the outside world and its mysteries. But just as he was about to fall into sleep's embrace, another sound caught his attention, a sound that did not belong to the rain or the storm. It was something different, a barely perceptible whisper that seemed to come from somewhere within the house. Simone tensed under the covers. The sound was faint but distinct, almost as if something was whispering in the hallway. Or perhaps it was just the wind finding new crevices through which to blow. With his heart beating fast again, he wondered if he should get up and investigate or stay in the relative and naive safety of his bed. The idea of leaving the covers filled him with an almost childlike fear, but at the same time, uncertainty and the need to understand tormented him. He decided to get up and quickly check the house. As he expected, he found nothing unusual, and as he returned to his bedroom, he convinced himself more and more that it was all tricks of his mind, completely exhausted from work. After all, this was exactly why he had decided to retreat to his grandmother's old house, to try to shut off his brain and detach it from the hectic activities that plagued him every day. Back in bed, he again used the heavy blanket as a shield and turned off the light on the bedside table next to him. However, the moment he turned off the light, the silence enveloping the room was broken by a whisper, this time distinguishable, light as the wind, but imbued with an intensity that carried terror and pain. The words, spoken in a slurred tone, rang out clearly. "Why did you leave me outside?" His heart seemed to stop, suspended in a moment of crystallized terror. That voice, so close, seemed to come from someone whispering directly into his ear. Simone remained motionless, holding his breath, while every sensation of warmth left his body. The room, already shrouded in darkness, seemed to become even gloomier. Time seemed to have stopped, and in that moment of tense, suffocating silence, Simone wondered if he had really heard those words, or if it was just another manifestation of a mind worn out by tension and fear. He gathered the courage to turn the light back on. With a movement that took every ounce of his will, he reached for the switch. When the light finally flooded the room, Simone quickly scanned every corner, every shadow, but there was nothing unusual, nothing. With his heart still pounding, he sat on the bed, trying to make sense of his thoughts. Logic told him it was just a product of his mind, an illusion born of tension and fatigue. But in some hidden corner of his consciousness, a silent voice suggested there was something more. His frantic gaze scanned every space, every little crack that could hide a secret, a clue to that unsettling presence he felt around him. He was almost on the verge of convincing himself that it was all a product of his fatigue and stress, that his mind was creating illusions to play tricks on him. But then, His eyes landed on the large mirror hanging on the wall opposite the bed. It was at that moment, in a suspended fragment of time, that he saw something that froze his blood. Behind him, emerging from behind the headboard of the bed, was that pale, distorted face that had watched him from the window. It stared at him through the mirror, with deep eyes and a malevolent smile that stretched from cheek to cheek, a grin that seemed too wide to be human. Terror struck him like a punch in the stomach, leaving him breathless for a moment before he could scream in terror with all the air he had in his lungs. The light went out suddenly, leaving Simone in total darkness and us in doubt about what happened.